Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast. Thomas Miller here along with Robert Glasscock, and we're going to tackle a listener question today.
Hi, Thomas and Robert. Love the new podcast. I have a question for both of you. I want to play devil's advocate. How would you respond if someone said that astrology is fake, it's all hocus pocus, it is just a scam? Thanks.
Wow, Robert, that's not a new question. That one's been around for thousands of years. The old pseudo-science question. How do you answer that?
Anybody and I love that question. I'm a born skeptic. I think you are too, Thomas. And I only say this because for listeners who don't know this, Thomas joined my course at practicums rather at Kepler College, I don't know, a year and a half, 2 years ago. And it's on just one technique, solar arcs. And this class, which has now been going 4 years and 9 months continuously, it's the longest running continuous predictive astrology workshop on Earth. 4 years and 9 months. And we're doing what's called mundane astrology, which is basically predicting world events and politics. And Thomas, when you first joined my workshops, you'd been there, I don't know, 2 or 3 weeks. And I love this question. And you said in front of the group, bear me out, how accurate do you think you guys have been?
Hey, my time is valuable.
Yeah, tell me. So is mine. And this is why I love this question, because I think it's the only sane question to ask. The only people who generally ask this, do you think, you didn't say is astrology bunk. You just said, how accurate do you think you've been? My answer was in front of the group, and I said, some of you have been here the whole time. You'll back me up or not. If I'm lying, I'm dying. And I said, Thomas, I would have to say 95 to 97% accurate. Now, the truth is, we have been 100% accurate. We have not predicted everything, of course. You can't. That's impossible. But everything that we have looked at and made predictions about, we have been right. Down to very specific things like predicting the winners of Georgia's congressional race.
That was amazing.
Last year.
The runoff.
So in addition to this, now these are all recorded and archived. So this isn't just BS off the top of my head. The results are really indisputable because events either happen, verified in the media, in the headlines, or they don't. It's that simple. And one of the reasons I love this practicum so much is it's such a wonderful way to learn astrology and see it in action, because we study the charts, we make our assessments, we analyze them, we discuss them, and make predictions, including things like the trajectory and timings of Donald Trump's demise, his slow demise, his election loss to Joe Biden, the violence and the deaths at the January 6th insurrection, the Supreme Court's abortion decision and its repercussions across society and the economy, we've predicted. We've predicted the increasing polarization in this nation and its threat to democracy and the union.
That's been the amazing one.
We even predicted, and this goes back to the beginnings of these practicums, potentials for a civil war, which we first discussed at the beginning of 2018, long before any such potential had broached the media.
That's exactly right. There was never a comment in the media about civil war, and now you see it everywhere.
So now, and I go back to, again, I'm a skeptic by nature. And as you know, all of you who've listened to these things before, the only reason I am an astrologer today is because the first book that was recommended to me, the old A to Z horoscope maker and delineator, and I found a used copy in those days that the new copies hadn't been published yet, found this old copy. The book was written in the 30s. And it flat said, you have a mole, mark, or a scar on the left side of your head or face from age 5, which I do. And it stunned me so much. I think I was expecting things like, oh, you're sociable and you like to dance and you love girls and like to date and all, just that kind of stuff. Oh no, a scar. It's a hairline scar. You can't see. But that hooked me. And I thought, wait a minute, how can this old book be that specific about something on on the left side yet of my head or face? And I couldn't believe that astrology could be that specific. Later on, my sister called me, and she was living in Minneapolis. She was telling me the next day she was going into surgery for uterine cancer. And I commiserated with her. And after we hung up, I had her horoscope. I looked at it and I called her back and said, for what it's worth, I looked at your horoscope. And of course, she hates astrology. She's a psychologist. But like all skeptics, when I said to her under those circumstances, I just looked at your chart, she just interrupted me. Did you really? They're kind of desperate for hope. And I said, I don't think you have cancer. I think you have fibroids. And you'll do fine with the surgery. In fact, you have a physical body that will heal incredibly well from this surgery. And the next day after the surgery, I heard from her, guess what? You're right. It was fibroids.
Amazing.
And a month later, she called me up and said, remember telling me how well I would heal from this surgery? Well, I went in to see my surgeon this morning for a follow-up, and she asked me, she said, when did we do this surgery? And I said, a month ago. And she said, I can't believe this. It looks like we did this 2 or 3 months ago. You've healed so well. So suddenly she got very curious about astrology. So with time, obviously, I've been doing this 57 years. I'm no longer skeptical. But it's these solar arc practicums on mundane astrology, which is what the students wanted. I thought they would want to do solar arcs in their natal charts, but no, they wanted to do this using mundane astrology, which is political astrology and world events. So that kind of track record, thankfully, is all recorded. And in fact, I've written a couple of articles that are still on Kepler's site that they keep up about the solar arcs and some of these predictions. You can't really argue with facts, and it's natural, I think, for people. You hear this kind of 97% or even 100% accuracy. And we've discussed this, as you know, Thomas, in these mundane workshops. You were dealing with the charts, the horoscopes of nations, like the horoscope for the United States, or the horoscopes of public figures. And the truth is that public figures, people like Joe Biden and Donald Trump, who have chosen to live these very public lives and careers, actually have fewer options than you or I do as just normal citizens. Everything that they do is on the public record, even if they don't want it to be, as we're finding out with the Trump administration. So it's almost like living in a goldfish bowl. People who live those kinds of lives, in a sense, their souls have chosen to become public figures and to live a collective life. So they are embodiments of the collective archetypes, and they represent those to a much more obvious and seemingly fatalistic degree than you or I do. We have options. If we don't like our jobs, we can walk out. You don't walk out of the White House. You're there. And there are many, many constraints over what your options are as a public figure of that magnitude. So those charts, and the chart of the United States, for example, which is a collective chart, can be read a bit more fatalistically than you would ever do with a natal chart, because an individual always has choices. And those are, when you see things in a horoscope that you don't want in your life, which is one of the main points of astrology, then the horoscope also says, here's the solution. Try this, think about this, try it this way, look at this option. So suddenly the fact about astrology is it really gives you a greater awareness of your own free will than if you live life without it. I have a horrible chart. And when I first looked at it at 21, I thought, my God, this is awful. The old A to Z delineator again. Can I do anything about this? Well, of course you can. And that's the whole point of astrology, is to see your shortcomings and your strengths, your assets, your liabilities, and see why you're getting results that you're getting in life, the ones that displease you. Do something about them. Change your fate. It's there to be changed. Free will is always, always, always present. And I think the truth, Thomas, we create our own free will. Our free will creates our own fate, rather.
Let me walk us back to something in our recent history. I'd love to get your comment on this. We all remember the pandemic. I think it may be still going on. I don't know. May 9th, 2020. Okay, now COVID breached our lives the end of January 2020. So this is February, March, April. So about 3 months after COVID first appeared, the New York Times came out with a big headline that said, "Will coronavirus kill astrology?" And the gist of the article was that nobody that they could find predicted the pandemic. And they said, therefore, their conclusion was astrology doesn't work. So let's go back to Chet's question, playing the devil's advocate. If we were at a little gathering and somebody's body language obviously started to change when the subject of astrology came up and they happened to know about this article and they say, yeah, but none of you astrologers predicted the pandemic, what would you say?
First of all, I would say that's an idiot's question. How does he know that nobody predicted the pandemic? Because we did in these workshops from the transits of Neptune. So I don't know when people make those blanket statements like that, you think, are you kidding me? You have read every astrology or column on Earth and you'd be, well, they haven't. They're making a statement that's simply not true. When they say no astrologer predicted the pandemic, that's nonsense.
Of course, your information is private, so they wouldn't have had access to it.
That's what I mean. So they don't know that no astrologer predicted the pandemic because, in fact, several of us did.
So what did you see? So remember, this was being talked about in 2018, 19, full 2 years before the pandemic. What did you see?
We saw transiting Neptune in Pisces of viruses and pandemics. Neptune rules viruses, it rules pandemics, and so does Pisces. And Pisces is the foundation of our chart. It's the bottom of the United States chart, the fourth house of the United States. And birth Neptune, natal Neptune in the United States chart is at the top in the 10th house of the presidency, among other things, and the government in Virgo. So here we have transiting Neptune in Pisces opposite our nation's birth Neptune at the 10th house. So in addition to the pandemic and viruses, we're also dealing with environmental pollution. We discussed all of this going back to the beginning of 2018 when Donald Trump was still president. We discussed the coming famine and water crises, the infrastructure crises, every bit of this stuff. So when this guy says no astrologer predicted these things, he's nuts. Pardon me, that's a little blunt. Maybe
I think it was a guy that wrote the article. Let me look. Actually, I've got it right here. Let me just see if let's get our gender pronouns correct here.
Oh, yeah,
yes.
let's please.
No, I'm sorry. It's a she.
Well, she's nuts.
Haley Phelan.
Okay, whoever. But the minute you hear people make a blanket statement like that, at least my response is, where'd you get that? Where did you learn that no astrologer on Earth predicted the pandemic? And watch them shuffle, because they didn't. It's impossible to know. First of all, when you hear a statement like, are you kidding me? You've researched every astrologer on Earth and you know that none of them? That's stupid. Pardon me, I have no respect for people who operate that way. That's BS. That's just straight BS.
I love your frankness around this.
Well, this irritates me because I think it's so stupid. It's a lack of critical thinking. It's a lack of intelligence. It's a lack of logic. And I find it insulting. No, not about astrology, about anything.
All right, then let me ask you this. It's no secret on any of my podcasts that recently there was a tragic death of a young man that was close to me. And in his mom's chart, it happened on her second Saturn return. Now, that's all we're going to talk about here. But that doesn't mean that everybody who has a Saturn return is going to have a death of somebody close to them.
True.
In
Exactly
fact,
true.
In fact, far from it. So that's where people can point at this and say, okay, see, how did it affect one person this way and another person starts a new business and it succeeds at the same time?
That's why it's so important to know each individual's horoscope. And, again, back to the question about does astrology work, or is it accurate, or is it hokum? It's still one of my favorite anecdotes about this was the letter and email I got about 1:20 in the morning from a woman up in Washington State. Well, I never met her. Her daughter had been a student in my horary workshops, which is another branch of astrology. She wrote me at 1:20 in the morning to tell me that her father had had a stroke and was in intensive care, that the doctors wanted to take him off of food and water for 6 days to look at his brain tissue. And she was afraid if they did that, it would kill him. Her brother and sister, on the other hand, were in agreement with the doctors, whatever they wanted to do. Could I see anything? And then she mentioned, I can find his birth certificate somewhere if I look for it, if you need it. Well, it's 1:20 in the morning. This man is in intensive care. I'm not going to wait around for her to go find his birth certificate. This is a critical question. I didn't need his horoscope. If you know astrology, what you are looking at is a snapshot in space-time from the perspective of the astrologer, my location. So I knew that the second that I fully understood her question, if I set up a horoscope, an horary chart for where I was when I understood her question, it would give me the answer because I've done this so long. And I looked at it, and the chart said he would die in within 5 days, about 3.5 days is what it said. So I wrote her back, not a long letter, but explaining to her that he was ready to go. And I also said, of his 3 children, you are the closest to his heart. And he knows you're not ready to let him go yet. And that's why and I suggested if it were me, I don't know if they would let you do this in intensive care, but I said I would go find one of those little Chinese, Japanese tabletop water fountains and plug it in, put it beside his bed in intensive care so they could hear the trickling. It will relax him. It will relax even the nurses and doctors as they visit him, if they can do that. But I said I would expect him to go within 5 days. And I didn't hear anything back for about a week. And her daughter, my student, wrote and said, I don't know how you did this without his birth chart, but he died 3.5 days later. Now, Thomas, the idea that a snapshot of the solar system, from my perspective, 2,000 miles away, never having met any of these people, can tell you specifically that this man is likely to die in 3.5 days. That's stunning. It still stuns me because the implication of this is that somehow individual and collective human lives are intimately linked with astronomically observed planetary cycles. There is something unbelievably compelling about that truth. If this didn't work, I would have been wrong and I would have been out of business, because if it didn't work, I couldn't have been doing this 57 years. You see what I mean? So people who say that, I know, are totally unfamiliar with it. And not only that, they don't want to be. I have a great doctor friend, cardiologist all my life, retired now, a Scorpio like you.
Uh-oh.
Who can't stand astrology. He thinks it's such bunkum until I start telling him, yeah, well, My sister didn't have cancer. She had fibroids, and astrology said that was what well, he just dismisses that because it doesn't agree. He can't let himself believe it for whatever reasons. I don't know. But I've never met anybody anywhere who has studied astrology seriously for any length of time who doesn't find out, wait a minute, this works. Now, that is not to say that every single thing in our lives is predictable. It isn't.
Right. Right.
There are too many complexities, and there is free will. And this is where I make that distinction between people like the presidents or big public figures like that and individual lives. Their lives are, in fact, a lot more fatalistic than ours, than yours and mine. And you can make predictions, and you can certainly make predictions from the United States chart, which is another amazing feat after all these years that chart can be that accurate, but it is.
In the blanket umbrella category, like when we listed our podcast, they make you pick a category, right, that the podcast is going to be under. Spirituality. Mm-hmm. When we talk about spirituality in general, not religion, spirituality, the spiritual realm of the universe and of our lives. Is there also this area, I think this is a rhetorical question, but this area of faith as well, that we just have to take spirituality as faith? It's not something that we can put into a test tube like the scientist can in a laboratory and replicate it 50 times with exactly the same outcome.
Well, as far as that last part about replicating it 50 times with exactly the same outcomes, no, of course not, because every human being is a completely different complex of genetics and birth circumstances and so on. So, no, that's not possible. But it certainly is possible. Go back to the first part of your question. I want to make sure I got that right.
Yeah, faith. Basically saying that there's, like when you've been doing this for let this sink in, folks, nearly 60 years. As I've jokingly said, I was in diapers when you started to do astrology.
Thanks a lot for reminding me.
And it's like, I don't consider us that far apart in age, but it's like that you just have a tremendous legacy of doing this. And yet, every time you look at a Mars aspect, or every time you look at a Saturn conjunction, or a Saturn return, or anything in the chart, you have this high degree of certainty. And yet there is that element of trusting in the process, trusting in the years that you've been doing this, and trusting in the symbolism. That's faith.
Well, you see, I am a skeptic. I have Mercury and Jupiter, in Virgo, so in my ninth house, and I am a skeptic. I'm a show me kind of guy. Well, luckily, the first book that was recommended to me showed me right off the bat, you have a mole mark or scar on the left side of your head or face from age 5. Excuse me?
Got your attention.
Yeah, it did. And that showed me, right? All right. And then as you go on through it, and as far as faith goes, I'll tell you, well, this is Richard Dawkins, biologist at Oxford University, wrote The God Delusion and a number of other books. He is an atheist, he professes. I am not an atheist. I have a wonderful relationship with God, but it's very direct. And it's only, I think, I was skeptical from childhood, really, about religions. And as I grew older and grew up, I realized that religions, right now, today on Earth, there's some 10,000 different religions. Almost all of them, including Christianity, stem from astrotheology, which is the oldest. It predates Judaism even. The oldest religion. I could tell you a story about the sun, for example, every year. The reason I'm getting into this is that I don't have much faith in anything. I'm really skeptical. I'm a Virgo. That's an earth sign. It's very pragmatic. I want to see proof. And what I have found proof of is that the internal psychological, spiritual connection with God, or the all that is what the Seth books, for example, call it. That is a very personal, and it's absolutely there from birth. It's a personal experience that you can have. And the Seth books, for example, were my favorite one of them is The Nature of Personal Reality, which really is still, to me, one of the most remarkable books ever written, uh, explains to you how your belief systems about life create your reality. And as I began to read that book, I thought, wow, this is exactly like astrology, which shows you a person's core belief systems about money, about health, about love, about marriage, about career, about work, and so on. That's what the chart shows you. And as you believe, you will automatically create, and you're constantly creating your reality. I keep reiterating, there's not one cell, tissue, or organ in your body that was there 7 years ago. We are constantly sloughing off dying dead cells and replacing them with new ones. And we're not even aware of it. We are constantly dying. Our whole body is constantly dying and being reborn at the same time. New cells, new tissues, new organs. So if those new cells are created under a different belief system, a core belief, then that's how you can change your reality. And I'm a tester. I want to test it. So with the Seth books, for example, which I first encountered when they were first published in I think the early 70s. And he says in the book, he says, try this exercise. You'll see results in 3 days. Well, by George, you do. But the deeper thing is that astrology lets you really look at your core beliefs about all these different areas of life and realize those are beliefs that I have. And some of them are very hard to accept sometimes. And you can change the beliefs. And there are very simple and very profound exercises and they're all internal that you do to look at your core beliefs. And by George, you do see a change in your real life. So once again, as a skeptic, that's all I need when I know what God is for me. I'm not professing to know what God is for anybody else, but it sure's worked for me all of my life. And by this age, believe me, it's an amazing fact that I've known now for about the last 7 years. I'm 77 today, in great shape, perfect health. I could get hit by a Mack truck tomorrow.
Don't.
But I have been aware for the last about 7 years, Thomas, and never before in my life, I have been continuously happy. And I've had a lot of happy things happen to me in life, but I've never before experienced this kind of base metabolism of happiness and gratitude for it, believe me. But it's also been conscious all the way. So I'm a skeptic. I investigate, I read, I think, I use logic. Richard Dawkins, I mentioned a moment ago, I think it was in The God Delusion. He says, and this is not paraphrasing, this is an exact quote, religion is an evil precisely because it requires no justification and brooks no discussion. Boom, period, end of sentence. And he's right. Try arguing or pointing any of these things out to someone who is deeply religious. How do you know that's the word of God? Well, they don't. The only thing you can say it was the word of John or another apostle, because from the get-go, the early Christians were hit with this response. Well, wait a minute, that's just like the old Egyptian religion, which indeed it is. And the Christians said, yeah, but ours is real. Ours is true. And of course, they've been fighting ever since to prove that it's true. If we had an assemblage of all of the supposed pieces of the true cross, we would have something about the size of the Empire State Building at this point.
Hey, let me ask you this, because maybe this is part of the disconnect as well, is how you approach astrology, what knowledge basis you have of the craft, and how you practice it. Now, this would be as wrong of me as saying the New York Times reporter combing the universe saying nobody predicted coronavirus. To say, I've not experienced anybody who approaches the chart and has the eyes for it that you do. Maybe others do, certainly. But, I live about 30 minutes from the town of Cherokee, North Carolina. And one of the things that's very prominent in any Indian tribal culture is the fact that the elders are leaving without passing that knowledge of the tribe on to the younger generation. It's been going on for a long time. But now we're at that critical point where the elders that still are alive today are really the last ones holding the bag. And that's why I think it's so important what we're doing here and what you're doing with Kepler is passing this information on so that others can learn to see the chart the way that you do. And I think that is critically important because you have a way of doing this that I've not seen with anybody else.
Well, thank you. I'm assuming that there are a lot of people like me that do it, but it's always sad to me to watch the decline of especially Native American religions because they're very connected with the earth
and the
sky, which they hold holy, and we don't. We're so separated now from nature by technology and so on. Going back to religion and skepticism and faith, that reporter, for example, her core belief is that astrology is nonsense. So she will never accept any evidence to the contrary.
Maybe she'll hear this. Maybe I'll send it to her.
Well, you may. But, I can sit here and spout this stuff off to you all day long, and it's all recorded. That's my main point. I'm not Gene Dixon back in the, 60s when Kennedy was assassinated.
Yeah.
And she claimed that she had predicted his assassination, and it turned out she had not. She was exposed. She was a fraud. And she had an 800 number very early on. Dial in for $1 a day, and you can get my psychic predictions. So that's that level of this.
Right. Right.
But I'm not doing that. I'm doing stuff that's recorded, that's archived, that I've written about, that you can check, because that's how I am. I didn't believe in astrology when I first encountered it because I didn't know anything about it. And I guarantee you, if that woman, and she never will, but if she were to seriously explore astrology, then she would also find, indeed, there is something to it. You can't do what I just did with a dying man 2,000 miles away that you've never met and predict that he's going to die in 3.5 days.
And not from his natal chart.
And without his natal chart. And it only works because I understand the synthesis between a person's intense question about a parent dying and contacting me as an astrologer. Out of all the astrologers, she chose me because her daughter had studied with me. I understand that moment, and I happened to read it. She sent it, and I was up at 1:20 in the morning, and I read it, and I instantly identified with her and her need to know. Now, if she had written me saying something like, my husband's father is in intensive care. He's very wealthy. Can you see when he's going to die? Meaning, can you see when we're going to get the money? I wouldn't have bothered answering it.
There you go.
And in fact, I had that situation arise in a real life reading.
Sure.
Probably 10 years ago. And the woman asked me that question, and I looked at her and I actually said, Thomas, how would you feel if I told you, yes, your husband's father is going to die and leave you guys the money? How would you feel? Oh, God, it'd be wonderful. Yada, yada, yada. I said, how would you feel if I told you, no, he's going to live another 20 years? And then I said to her, the point is not when your father-in-law is going to die and leave you the money. The point is, what's wrong with this marriage? You think if he dies and leaves you this money, it's going to save your marriage. It won't. You think if you have a baby, it's going to save your marriage. It won't. And I made her think.
Yeah.
Never answered the question about the father dying. And sure enough, that couple divorced within a year. And I happened to see him about 3 or 4 years later, and he had found a wonderful woman that I happen to know too, and they'd gotten married and live in New York now. I'm very happily. So it's the intent behind a question that tells me as an astrologer, is this a valid question, or is this one of these questions with a hidden agenda? What she really wanted to know was how she could save her marriage, which was ending for all obvious reasons. I mean, if you have, that's what your wife wants to know when your dad's going to die and leave you all his money. Nah. So,
well, I've been able to learn enough of your style that when this death happened this past week, I was able to apply what I know. And there's so much that I don't, but I was able to apply what I know. and look into this and see the situation. And I'll tell you how I got there, folks. Robert, let me just explain what I've done with your practicum classes. If you guys will get a digital notes program of some sort, something where you can search and set up the planets, the houses, the signs, aspects, and then as you listen to Robert, whether you do it here or you get his books that are on Amazon, his booklets, his pamphlets, we're going to be adding to that more, and obviously a big body of work is being assembled here, that if you will list out the things that he says under those respective categories, when he talks about Mars, capture that. When he talks about the sixth house, capture what he's saying about that. Then you will have a searchable database, and you can go back, and then you'll encounter one of these real-life situations, and you can go back and you can target the various areas of where that shows up in the chart, and you'll have at least his commentary and notes on things that he's discussed in the past. And then, Robert, I guess it's onus on us. We really do need to create a body of work that hands this off to these kids that are coming up who are going to be hearing this and be very interested in astrology, and hopefully we'll create something that there it will be waiting for them.
From your lips to God's ear.
Well, we got to get busy. Thank you so much for this. And if you would like to talk to Robert, the information is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening to this. Chet, hope that helps, and others who encounter the question, what about the pseudo-science of astrology? We'll see you next time on the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast with Robert Glasscock. Thank you for listening.